You check your portfolio, close the app, put your phone down, then pick it up 2 minutes later and check again. Nothing meaningful changed. You know that, and yet you checked anyway. Back in the app, looking at the same numbers. If you've done this, and most investors have, more often than they'd admit, this isn't curiosity, it isn't diligence, and it definitely isn't improving your returns. There's a specific mechanism driving that loop, and once you understand it, the behavior starts to look very different. Here's what makes this behavior genuinely strange when you look at it directly. At some level, you already know nothing meaningful has changed between checks. Yes, prices move in real time, but the kind of change that actually matters for a long-term strategy doesn't happen in 2 minutes. You know this, and yet your brain treats each check like something important might have happened, as if those 2 minutes created a window where something needed your attention. Here's where it gets interesting. That pull, that quiet urgency to check again, isn't responding to actual information. It's responding to the possibility of it. And that distinction sits at the center of everything this video is about. Because your brain doesn't wait for information to justify attention. The possibility alone is enough. Before we get to the mechanism, it's worth noticing something about the emotional texture of this experience. Not all checks feel the same. You open the app, and the portfolio is up 0.8%. You register it. Maybe a brief flicker of satisfaction. Then you close the app. You open it, and it's down 1.2%. That lands differently. The number holds your attention in a way the gain didn't. You look at it longer. Maybe check which positions moved. You're more likely to open the app again. A small drop doesn't feel small. It feels unresolved. This isn't symmetrical. Gains and losses of the same size don't produce the same response. And that asymmetry, which we covered in the loss aversion video, is one of the engines driving the checking loop. But it's not the only one. Here's the part that actually explains the compulsion. Every time you open your portfolio app, one of a few things can happen. It can be up, it can be down, or it hasn't moved much at all. The specific outcome is uncertain until you look. And that uncertainty, that repeated moment of not knowing, resolved by checking, activates one of the most powerful reinforcement mechanisms the human brain has. Psychologists call it variable ratio reinforcement. It's the same mechanism behind slot machines. Not because every pull pays out, but because any pull might. That unpredictability is what makes the behavior so hard to stop. You've probably felt this without noticing. When you already know what you'll see, the urge to check is weak. But when there's uncertainty, when it could have changed, the pull gets stronger. Not because of the information itself, but because of the anticipation of it. Uncertain rewards trigger stronger dopamine responses than predictable ones. The brain responds not just to what it receives, but to what it might receive. Every portfolio check is a pull of the lever. And the more often you pull, the harder it becomes to stop. And just like a slot machine, the more unpredictable it feels, the harder it is to walk away. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. Occasionally it moves enough to feel meaningful. But that variability is what keeps the loop running. Not the information, the chance of it. And this is where it starts to spill into behavior. Because the more often you expose yourself to those unpredictable outcomes, the more often you feel like you should respond to them. But there's another layer on top of the variable reward loop, the one that makes the behavior feel responsible rather than compulsive. Checking your portfolio feels like staying on top of your money, like engagement, like diligence, like the behavior of someone taking their financial future seriously. There's a quiet narrative running alongside it. I'm monitoring my investments. I'm paying attention. I would know if something required a response. This is where it gets expensive. Because what the checking is actually doing, for most investors, most of the time, is tracking how the portfolio makes you feel. Not whether anything needs to be done, just how it feels, right now, in this moment. And that, moment-to-moment emotional response to price movement, is one of the least useful inputs into a long-term decision. This is where the illusion of control comes in. People consistently overestimate their ability to influence outcomes in uncertain environments. In investing, that shows up as the belief that monitoring creates control, that attention itself gives you an edge. But for a long-term investor, the moment that actually requires action rarely arrives within a day or a week, and the monitoring that was supposed to catch it instead produces a constant stream of emotional noise, Small gains, small losses, minor fluctuations, all of it interpreted by the brain as signals when in most cases they're not. And this is the part most people don't examine, because it goes deeper than money. Every time you check your portfolio, you're not just checking a number, you're checking a verdict. Not just on the portfolio, but on yourself. Was I right to make this investment? Is my strategy working? Did I make a good decision? In that moment, the portfolio becomes feedback on your judgment. A gain feels like validation. A loss feels like something more, like proof that something was wrong. And this is where it compounds. When the portfolio is down, the urge to check again isn't just about the money. It's about resolving that doubt. The checking becomes a search for relief, for the number to move back up and quietly say, "You weren't wrong." This is why volatile markets drive near compulsive checking, even in disciplined, long-term investors. Because the volatility isn't just affecting the portfolio, it's affecting the identity of the person behind it. Research on self-attribution bias shows that investors credit gains to their own skill, but struggle to reconcile losses the same way. So a sustained loss doesn't just feel financial, it creates tension between how you see yourself and what the portfolio is showing you. And the checking continues, partly to monitor the loss and partly to wait for the moment the story changes. Here's how this becomes structural rather than situational. Over time, the checking loop stops being a response to the market and becomes a pattern, a habit, something that happens at certain times of day, whether there's any reason to check or not. You've probably done this without noticing. The morning check before work, the midday check during lunch, the evening check before sleep. You're not even thinking about it anymore. You open the app the same way you check messages. Different moments, same behavior. And in the context of a long-term strategy, none of these checks serve a real purpose. The information isn't actionable. It doesn't change the decision. But once the habit is established, it's no longer about information. It's about the ritual. A small release of background tension, briefly reduced by checking, and then quietly rebuilt. This is how habits form. Behaviors repeated in consistent contexts become automatic, triggered by cues, not decisions. The phone on the desk, the lunch break, the moment between tasks. The cue appears and the loop runs. Not because you chose to check, because the cue was there. This is where it gets uncomfortable. There's a contradiction at the center of this behavior that most investors never fully confront. You say you're a long-term investor. The strategy is built around time, holding, compounding, letting outcomes play out. That's the stated position. And this is the part most people miss. The behavior is entirely short-term. Checking 10 times a day is not long-term investor behavior. It's the pattern of someone reacting to short-term price movement in real time while maintaining a narrative of long-term discipline. And that contradiction has consequences. Investors who check their portfolios more frequently tend to trade more, time those trades worse, and end up with lower long-term returns than those who check less. Not because they know less, but because constant exposure to short-term movement generates emotional responses, the strategy was never designed to handle. The strategy says hold. The reaction to the red number says act. And the more often you check, the more often that conflict appears. And the more chances emotion has to override the plan. Now here's the piece that amplifies everything we've covered. If you watch the loss aversion video, you already know the core idea. Losses tend to weigh more heavily than equivalent gains. Here's how that connects to the checking loop. Every time you open your portfolio and the number is down, even slightly, your brain registers a loss, not as information, as a threat. And that response is stronger than the satisfaction of an equivalent gain, which means the checking loop isn't emotionally neutral. It's biased toward negative experiences because the losses, even small ones, hit harder than the gains. And this is where it compounds. Even a well-performing portfolio will produce daily fluctuations. For someone checking 10 times a day, that can mean multiple loss signals every single day, each one disproportionate, each one reinforcing a background sense of tension that has very little to do with actual performance. The checking isn't just ineffective, it's actively creating anxiety from a situation that, at the right time frame, wouldn't require it. This doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects how you perform. The real damage from compulsive portfolio checking isn't just psychological, it's financial, and it arrives through a specific, well-documented mechanism. The more often you check, the more it feels like you should act. This is where it gets expensive. This pattern isn't theoretical. Large-scale studies of retail investors show that the more frequently people trade, the worse their returns tend to be. Not because they choose worse investments, but because the timing of those decisions, driven by reaction, not strategy, quietly erodes performance over time. The checking loop creates the conditions for overtrading. This is what researchers call the behavior gap, the difference between what the strategy should deliver and what the investor actually earns. And it's not small. Research tracking actual investor returns, not theoretical portfolio performance, shows a consistent gap, often in the range of 1 to 3 percentage points per year. Not from lack of knowledge, but from behavior. Decisions made in response to short-term movement inside a long-term strategy. Compounded over time, that becomes significant. It's the financial cost of checking too often, feeling too much, and acting on signals the strategy was designed to ignore. The checking habit doesn't end through intention alone. Deciding to check less usually lasts until the next period of market volatility, when the anxiety overrides the decision. What tends to work is structure, friction, and schedule. Friction. Making the portfolio slightly harder to access. Removing the app from the home screen. Adding an extra step between the impulse and the information. Not as a barrier, but as a pause. A moment where awareness returns to a process the habit was running automatically. Schedule. Replacing open-ended checking with defined review windows. Once a week, once a month for long-term positions. The information doesn't change. The context does. It turns reactive, emotional monitoring into deliberate review. Some investors go further, automating contributions entirely. Money moves on schedule without requiring a check-in that could trigger an emotional response at the wrong moment. None of this is about caring less. It's about making sure the attention you give your portfolio is the kind that supports the strategy, not the kind that quietly works against it. So the next time you open your portfolio and feel that pull to check again 2 minutes later, that's not discipline. That's the loop running, the variable reward, the identity check, the habit, running on cues you don't even notice. You built a long-term investment strategy for a reason. It doesn't need to be monitored 10 times a day to work. It needs to be followed. And following it, behaviorally, not just in intention, means limiting how often short-term noise gets a chance to interfere. For long-term investors, portfolios tend to perform better when they're watched less. Not because the market responds to your attention, because your decisions do. If this reframed the way you think about your portfolio monitoring habits, subscribe for more on the psychology behind everyday financial decisions. And I'll see you in the next one.